Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. I'm Jacques Biot, I'm the president of École Polytechnique. I see quite a few of our students here in the room, and so they will tell you that I rarely come to the microphone without speaking for at least, what did you say, more than 1 hour? So no, actually I'm going to be short this time, and it's a relief for them. Just to introduce this series of discussions on science, technology and society, which have been set up jointly by Columbia and by École Polytechnique, and I really wish to thank both involved departments in both institutions for setting this program. Actually, this comes really at the crossroad of two very important lines in Polytechnique's action. One is our interest in social sciences, which is often not so well known. And the second one is the importance of our collaboration with Columbia. So just a few words for those who are not from Polytechnique to tell you who we are. Actually, Polytechnique was founded at the time, 1794, which is very similar to the times that we're living today. France, at that time, the world was not so large for us. It was limited to France, but France was under very heavy attack. And it was just the end of the age of enlightenment. And the people who were heading France at that time understood that all the outcomes of this age of enlightenment in terms of science and technology, all the discoveries of the 18th century basically, could help save the nation against the threats that were threatening the nation. And we feel that the situation is pretty much the same today. Actually, we live in a world where actually mankind is facing four major challenges. One of the economic challenge with indebtedness, which has reached levels never reached before, twice GDP of the earth in terms of indebtedness of governments and households together. Negative interest rates, which nobody understands, which are probably the sign of a very depressive society if you consider interest rates as a preference of the present for the future. I mean, people are not happy in the present. Second challenge is the climate challenge. We all know about COP21 and COP22 now coming in Marrakesh, and the NOAA report in July showing that the world has never been so warm. Then there is the sanitary challenge with a number of new infections, and we will have more infections. 21st century will be a century of infections, and it's also a century of aging populations. And finally, the security challenge that we face mostly in Europe with terrorism, terror attacks, and which is pretty much going to be addressed, I guess, by Thomas today. So that's the situation. So we feel that Polytechnique has a very big role to play, and in this world, Polytechnique generates and disseminates knowledge, top-notch knowledge, pluridisciplinary, and when we say pluridisciplinary, we put a lot of emphasis on social sciences. So what we teach our students is that they have to understand several sciences, because every science challenges the perspectives of other sciences, and social sciences, philosophy and sociology and all the soft sciences challenge, I would say, pure sciences, and are very important. There is no science that can produce outcomes if it's not well accepted by society. And this is, I think, the aim of this program that has been set up. We have a very strong collaboration with Columbia. Polytechnique is the 29th most international university in the world, by the way. 40% of our faculty is international, and our speaker today, Thomas, will be kind of a testimony to that. Thomas is of German origin, and he's been working at the University of Versailles-Saint-Quentin. He's still working at the University of Versailles-Saint-Quentin, and now at Polytechnique. And he's a visiting professor at Columbia in a program that has a lot of value for us, which is kind of our flagship in terms of international collaboration, thanks to Alessia and to our Alliance program, where every year we have an exchange of professors, so visiting professors in and out, both ways. We also welcome a number of Columbia students. Polytechnique has been investing very hard on entrepreneurship. Actually, we have a so-called Drahi Center, where we have gathered all activities related to entrepreneurship with an accelerator and a number of programs to foster entrepreneurship. So we have students from Columbia coming every year, bachelor students, to see what we do within their own core program. And then we decided to set up this series of discussions which really was timely. Polytechnique has 1,600 scientists, most of them in pure science, but we have decided to create a new, what we call laboratory. It's a research unit focused on social sciences that Frédéric heads, together with Michael Fussell, who is a philosopher in France and also very influential. And so Frédéric and Michael together have founded this lab, and this lab realized that Columbia was embarking on pretty much the same type of thinking. So that's the reason why we decided, along with the Alliance, to create this program. The first program will be dedicated to preventive war, which is a pretty, I would say, very current topic. But I think, Pamela, you will be introducing this session more in detail. So thank you all for being here, and long live the collaboration between Polytechnique and Columbia, and long live social sciences.
Thank you so much, Professor Biot. I'm thrilled to welcome you all here this evening. Both Frédéric and I are sharing the welcoming, so I'm going to keep it short because we have a lot of people to introduce and a lot to get through. So I simply want to say that we are very happy that this collaboration with the LinkX has begun, the laboratory for social sciences at the École, but also this general collaboration with the École Polytechnique, which has been, in my experience so far, absolutely incredibly fruitful, both for bringing really wonderful researchers and scholars to Columbia, but fabulous students. I have to say, I had 2 students this past year, and they were incredible students. I mean, the Columbia students are fantastic too, but I have to say these École Polytechnique students were really extraordinary, so keep sending them, please. I am the director of the Center for Science and Society, and as Professor Biot mentioned, both Frédéric and I he started LinkX, and I began the Center for Science and Society in almost the same year. So it was a great kind of convergence across the Atlantic of interest. And both of our, very clearly, Frédéric's center laboratory is dedicated to bringing together scientists and social scientists, as is the Center for Science and Society. We are trying to bring together all the disciplines, including law, humanities, and the arts, with natural scientists to form collaborative research groups and teaching collaborations. And so this is a wonderful transatlantic example of that kind of collaboration among disciplines and collaboration in the wider world. So thank you very much for being present here and for introducing this and for making it possible. I also want to thank the Alliance. We say Alliance and you say Alliance, but that's a little odd, the Alliance program. And Alessia in particular, and Shani Piers and the Maison Française. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Frédéric to introduce Professor Lindemann, and then after he speaks, I will be back to introduce the panelists. So Frédéric.
So as the director of the Linkcast, it's now my great pleasure as well to welcome you to this opening lecture of our discussion series. So as Pamela said, this event arises out of the collaboration between the Linkcast and the Columbia Center for Science and Society, which both bring together a wide range of scholars in the human, social, and natural sciences to support interdisciplinary research, teaching, and outreach about the roles of science in past and present societies. And so to be sure, science and technology raise pressing social concerns, such as the one that Jack has pointed to: security, public health, environment, and concerns which very often cut across the conventional lines of academic research and therefore call for cross-disciplinary integration. So today's opening lecture aims at exploring science and security issues, which, as everyone knows, raise important concerns not only in France and in the USA, but more generally at an international scale. The second lecture will take place in Paris on November 14. It will be devoted to racism and public health, and will revolve around the works of Professor Samuel Kelton Roberts from Columbia University. For our third session, we will return to Columbia on December 15th to discuss environmental concerns in connection to an art exhibition that recently took place at Centre Pompidou in France, and in which the historian Jean-Baptiste Fressoz has highlighted the role played by the aesthetic and philosophic concept of the sublime in our contemporary representations of the Anthropocene and climate change issues. So I'm now pleased to introduce our keynote speaker for this opening session, Thomas Lindemann, who is a professor of political science at École Polytechnique and Versailles University, and is currently a visiting scholar here at Columbia University. So his lecture will highlight the security dilemmas provoked by the Logics of Preventive War, which Professor Lindemann will connect to a specific alliance between science and a gendered vision of the war, of world politics. So a thesis that is quite challenging and maybe a bit controversial, and which we will have to debate during the roundtable and the general discussion. So thank you again for being here, and I now leave the floor to Thomas Lindemann.
So, thank you very much for this very nice, kind words, and also thanks to the organizers. Welcome. So, for a challenging debate, I hope. So, my thesis, it's already here presented. It is the idea that hard positivist science can induce favor international violence. So this can be now a bit astonishing. So we all link normally, you can say, science to reason, to more or less temperation, and we have the idea that emotion, irrationality are linked to violence. So this is a bit counter, you can say, against our intuition. But I will argue that some form of positivist science can lead to violence. My thesis is not the traditional Frankfurt School thesis. It's not to say that science is only more or less an instrument for bad ends. So it's not the argument about instrumental rationality. So it's not to say that physicians produce, I don't know, bombs without any reflexive, you can say, thought. The idea is that positivist science produces, at least sometimes, violent ideologies or favors a violent mindset for two reasons. So many other, but two reasons linked to, you can say, to psychologics, or more linked to psychologics. The first is that strong positivist science can favor alarmism. alarmism, inflated threat perceptions. We all know that in the moment we discuss about China, about the rise of China, we discuss about unavoidable conflict. So I quote John Mearsheimer. Strong determinism, this is one of my thesis, strong scientist determinism can induce the idea that a conflict is unavoidable in denying the other even the idea that he can change, or that he can do other things than power maximizing and so on. And the second idea, to link strong positivism to violence, to more or less to violent mindset, is the idea that science, so at least strong positivist, I will more precise it. It's not to say now that engineers are violent. It's not my idea, because I'm from Polytechnique. The second idea is that this framing, scientist framing of strong determinism, of even, I don't know whether you know the term, axiological neutrality, this idea that science has to be value-free, that we have to be detached, emotionally detached from the research topic, that this can induce sometimes violence insofar as it neutralizes our compassion to others. So if I treat others as objects, as only research objects, I can easily forget that these objects are human beings. So this is a bit my thesis, which can surprise some here. To avoid any, you can say, misunderstanding, I will focus on hard positivism. So I will only present some form of hard positivism, but quite widely spread in universities, in the Department of Economics, for example. So it's a bit, you can say, a science which refuses to separate human or social science from natural science. It's a vision which applies natural science in a mechanistic manner to social issues. And this form of science, for me, can induce international violence. So this is a thesis. I will now shortly present the plan. So the first section, my demonstration, is about a theory. So I will explain in more detail why hard positivism can be a source of violence, especially preventive war. Second, I will present a classic case study, the Peloponnesian War, described by Thucydides. And I will defend the hypothesis that Thucydides was the first, you can say, scientific historian. And as a scientific historian, he misinterpreted the Peloponnesian War as a preventive war. So I will come. It was not a preventive war, but he misperceived this war as, you can say, preventive, because he was already practicing a kind of nomological science, mechanistic science. So this is the first short case study. The second case study is World War I, outbreak of World War I. So we all link World War I normally to, I don't know, power dynamics, to imperialism, nationalism, but not to science. But in taking the German case, I will show that those in Germany, at least, favoring preventive war, had a scientist mindset, especially the German Chancellor, social Darwinist mindset, while others, unfortunately in minority, like the German ambassador Lichnowsky, were opposed to war and were more, you can say, traditional thinkers belonging to aristocratic society, believing that we are making history, so believing that great statesmen make history, they don't these aristocrats in this time were not believing that abstract forces were more or less determining our history. So this is the second case study, and case study 3 is not about preventive war. It's a bit more stimulation to say that even so-called Islamist terrorism can be linked, at least partly, to a scientist mindset. So this can be a small surprise for you, because we link it often to irrationality, to poor educated people, and so on. So let us shortly start with some definitions. So first of all, what is preventive war? I will be quite short. Preventive war is distinguished by a means, the means of the instrument of a preventive war is the resort to violence, and the means of preventive war is also anticipation. The idea is that there are instruments in order to establish who will be a future threat. So even statistical analysis. So sometimes, so even before World War I, there were statistical analyses about demographic growth, economic growth. So there are instruments to anticipate the future, which is, by the way, linked to 19th century industrialization, planification, which is a quite new logic in international politics. So preventive war is first characterized by a means, the use of force, anticipation of a removed threat, and you can say, okay, there is also an evaluation. The evaluation of threats is made not by evaluating your intentions or the intentions of a potential aggressor, but by limiting it to future capabilities. So I just identify who is rising, and then as rising power, who is more or less becoming stronger in the future. Now it's China, and I will say this is a threat. So threats are not deduced from intention, but from future capabilities. And okay, the finality of preventive war is to avoid future power shifts. So to ensure security. So now, what is hardcore positivism? So I have not the time to quote all authors. So I have taken in my discussion paper 3 quite classical thinkers. Auguste Comte, who was also teacher at École Polytechnique, who introduced a bit the positivist philosophy in France and even in Europe and elsewhere. I have then taken Émile Durkheim, especially his book Le Suicide, or The Suicide. And from the 60s, I have taken a famous figure in international relations. It's Morton Kaplan, who discussed, I guess Robert Jervis has a good souvenir, because he discussed with Kaplan. So if we take these 3 authors, but if we could also take people from the economic departments, from most of economic departments, and sometimes from political science departments, I would say hard positivism is characterized by at least four characteristics. The first one is that there is something as progress, and progress is more or less, there's a unique way to progress, so there's universal reason. So there's a kind of feeling of superiority of civilization, of one civilization over another. Hardcore positivists believe always that the past is separated from the present and the future, that there is an evolution. So take Auguste Comte, he said that we started with religious thinking, then metaphysical, and now finally we have the positivist thinking. So there's the idea of progress, and later I will say it can be linked to violence, unfortunately. And there's also the idea of nomological reason, that all things are more or less comparable, and that I have to discover, you can say, typical logics. So I have to refuse to discover the singular. So if I study, for example, wars, I will not study a particular war, but I will compare them, and I will limit myself to say what they share. And I will try to find a law for these social phenomena. So this is a bit the first hardcore positivist assumption. The next one is a deterministic version of human behavior. It means for a hardcore positivist, our minds, consciousness, human consciousness, agency, do not truly matter. We have the idea sometimes, so even if we take Emile Durkheim, that we have to study social facts as things. So he says, so human beings have to be studied as things. They are moved by external forces. So he refuses to go inside our minds. He would say that what we believe is our reason for acting is not our true reason. Our true reason is more or less escapes to our mind. So there's a strong determinism, and to quote Durkheim, Durkheim says, for example, that suicide is not an individual phenomenon, but there is for each society more or less a quota for suicide. So I will not ask why you committed suicide, but I will only analyze the society, and then I will link the structure of a society to a quota of suicide. You know, the individual disappears. There is no personal motivation for such things. The third aspect of hardcore positivism is a so-called regular time version. So time is measurable for a positivist. So there is no relativity. So we can say there are more positivists than physicians. So unfortunately. And there is often the idea that you can more or less deduce your future from past tendency. So our present tells us what will be our future. So it's like, let us take the Soviet Union. In the end of the 70s, many analysts believed that the Soviet Union was the rising force because they were getting more territories. So their growth rates were quite impressive, even if they were manipulated. And so transition power theorists believed that the Soviet Union was the power of the future, like Robert Gilpin. We all know that this is wrong, but it starts again with China. So it's always the idea of positivists that time is measurable, that we can more or less, that social behavior repeats, and that there is no true specificity, no context, no time, space context. We can more or less all compare without any distinction. And fourth one, you all know, I will not go further. The fourth assumption of hardcore positivism is that all things can be quantified. So I'm not against quantification, but it is a problem if you translate sometimes very qualitative phenomena in statistics. We all know that it's difficult to measure, for example, national coherence or moral forces, education, and so on. And often positivists, they drop all these aspects because it's not measurable. So let us now, so I have, I hope, more or less defined hardcore positivism and preventive war. Now the question is, how can we link positivism to preventive war logics? And so the first link or theoretical link is what I call here alarmism or inflated threat perceptions. Why inflated threat perceptions? Hardcore positivism first attributes aggressivity not to intentions, but to potential. So more you have potential, power potential, and more you will behave in an aggressive manner. So this is a bit like the worst case scenario. So you say another country is a threat, not because it has bad, or decision makers have bad intentions, but they have the ability to harm. So it's a bit the worst case. So scenario in evacuating all kind of intentions by kind of social determinism, often a material determinism. You are even not interested in calculating others' intention, appreciating others' intention. You automatically assume the worst case scenario. What could be possible with given capabilities. The second reason why positivism may lead to alarmism is that often quantitative determinants are overrated. For example, demography, often also geography. Now China, as I said, is identified as a future threat. But if we look at history, we all know that demographically speaking, never the most populated power was dominating world politics. But in a quantitative mindset, surely what is measurable is important, so it can induce the idea that people with quantitative important resources are a threat. Often they are much less dangerous than we believe. Take Russia, World War I. It was the first country which was dropping out of the war because its army was badly educated, poorly doing militarily speaking, problem of nationalities. All these determinants were not measured, you can say, by quantitative analysis. And the second reason why positivism may induce a violent mindset is that it first leads to a neutralization of empathy or compassion. If you have scientist mindset, you have more or less the obligation not to identify at all with a potential victim. Take, for example, the Milgram experience. I guess you have all heard about this Milgram experience. And often people attribute the violence of the Milgram experience to more or less to our submission to authority. So we act in a violent manner because there is an authority, there is a superior, he gives us an order and we execute it. But newer researchers show that the story is a bit more complicated. Indeed, Milgram, his setup of the experience was quite variable, and so Milgram discovered that people were more violent against the victim when the instructor said, "Do not identify with the victim." So if the instruction was, "Do not identify," if the victim was not visible, then the electroshocks were stronger than not. And it is also now examined whether the naming of the experience as scientific was another component of a violent attitude. To say, okay, this is violence, but it is for science, it's for the progress and so on. And there's another emotional reason why positivism may induce violence. It is so I have here used the term responsibility shifting. If you are only executor of so-called impersonal forces, if you say I act for history, let us take so-called scientific Stalinism. So it is laws of history are speaking. It's not me. So it's the same, sure, with the laws of race. Hannah Arendt has written about it. So this is responsibility shifting. You shift the responsibility to impersonal forces. So the kind of violence induced by hardcore positivism is not, you can say, hatred, ordinary hatred. It's not pure emotional violence, but it is, you can say, cold hatred. Your compassion is neutralized. You are acting in a manner considering others as more or less as objects. So this is another form of violence. So I'm not saying that there is no violence before science. It's just modifying the forms of violence. So let us now move to the case studies. So I have 3 case studies. I think it's a bit ambitious, probably, because time is running out. So I will only summarize my argument for the Peloponnesian War. So Thucydides' argument in chapter 2 is to say that this war is not the result of personal ambition. So it's not the, I don't know, it's not the failure of a regime, of a statement, but the true reason and the concealed reason of this war is Athens' rise and the fear that this rise of power triggered in Sparta. So the idea is that war was not triggered for personal reasons, for ideology, for ambitions, but it is just the scientific, more or less, sorry to use this term, so it's scientific analysis that there is a rising power, so it is Athens growing and growing, taking more and more territories, and then we, Sparta, we have no choice, we have to fight now, better now than too late. So this is Thucydides' argument. It is interesting that his mindset is quite compatible with a hardcore positivist mindset. So first of all, you can say he has a nomological orientation. He seeks for general laws. So even it is more complicated, I know, sometimes. So he speaks of human nature. So he wants to discover what is typical in this war, much more than the logic of the Peloponnesian, the particular logic of the Peloponnesian War. Second, you can say he's a bit, or he's determinist in the sense that power shifts move human agency. So there's no true human agency in the sense of external power shifts are decisive in questions of peace and war. And there's even, you can say, a kind of linear time conceptions, which is quite surprising, because there's a chronology. In chapter 3, he details Athens' rise to power, how Athens was getting more and more colonies. And it's organized in a chronologic manner, quite rational manner, while in this time, normally, in the Greek area, time was not at all organized. It was a fatum. There was even the possibility that, I don't know, divine forces could intervene in war. There was the idea of chance, of luck. But Thucydides, his time conception seems to be quite regular. And he's even a bit quantitativist, so maybe this is a bit strong, in the sense that his appreciation of Athens' rise of power is based on, you can say, of counting the colonies. And newer research show that Athens was first not truly rising, at least not in the years before the Peloponnesian War. Second, they show that, on the contrary, Athens was weakened less and less popular by its imperialist policy, and that there were qualitative forces in Sparta, which, and indeed Sparta finally was a winner. Okay, everybody was a loser, but Sparta was not weaker than Athens. So there was no true preventive war in the sense of Thucydides, but he believed it. And he believed it, in my opinion, because he was already a prisoner of a scientist mindset, avoiding all kind of the intervention of human frictions, of divine forces. So his ambition was to write a history without any myths, so only based on testimonies, and to be very concrete, so very positive, you can say, to report what he sees. I cannot too much say about the Peloponnesian War. So just to say that Thucydides was also not showing much compassion to victims. There were horrible massacres during the Peloponnesian War, for example, against the Elots, the Sparta slaves. And Thucydides, in a quite cold manner, only described it as a kind of instrumental violence, enhancing Sparta's domestic or coherence. Now let us go to the second case study, World War I. So again, it is a complicated case. But there is one more or less agreement. There is still agreement that it was the war was not possible without Germany's green light for Austria. So Germany gave Austria-Hungary green light to crush Serbia, and so it was the 5th, 6th July, so Blanco check, and German decision makers knew in this time that this action could more or less signify war. They knew it. They took the risk. So the question is why, first of all, why they took the risk to trigger a true world war while not being optimistic. They were not optimists, they were not saying we will dominate the world, but they were, on the contrary, quite pessimist. And in order to find an answer, we can refer to Bethmann Hollweg, the German chancellor, so the most important man in Germany, much more important than our Kaiser. Also, the Kaiser was only important on photos, on pictures. So sometimes, okay, for this decision he gave green light for the Blanco check. But Bethmann Hollweg, he explains in several letters to France that indeed this war was, in a certain sense, a preventive war. He admits in a letter to a personal friend, Hausmann, that this war was moved by preventive logics. He said that Russia grows and grows, so I will come later back to it. So this idea that Russia is the rising power, the power of the future, and that he was in the July crisis in a situation where he had to consider whether now was better than, you can say, than too late. So there are several other remarks, especially remarks addressed to his advisor Rietzler. So Rietzler, an advisor, he published, it's not Rietzler himself, but historians publish diaries. And in the diaries we can find repeated expression of fear of Russia growing and growing. So this is a true obsession of the German chancellor. And we have the same obsession, we can find it in other German decision makers' mind. So Jagov, Moltke, and so on. So I can quote endlessly others. All these people were more or less for preventive war logics. So they thought that it is better now to risk war than 2-3 years later. So the idea was not to trigger war, but to risk war to improve Germany's position. So this was a kind of, say, consensus. There was one exception, or several exceptions, but one big exception is the German ambassador in London, Lichnowsky, Karl von Lichnowsky. And so he wrote even later, and even during the war, he wrote a pamphlet opposing to Germany's war and blaming even the Chancellor and his advisors for this war. So it was quite courageous in this time. It was considered as a traitor, sure. And the question is, so we have now Lichnowsky as an exception. And I would argue that there are several explanations for this difference. Okay, if you're ambassador in London, you are often open-minded, probably for at least for the biggest European country. So maybe there's a kind of bureaucratic logics. But there's also a narrative logics, because, as I mentioned, Lichnowsky thought in quite traditional terms. He was from Catholic religion, so he was not a Protestant, he was not a Weberian mindset. He was quite unconventional. He had love affairs. He was engaged in many other affairs. And so it was what we say in France, a bon vivant, a bit. And he has a quite traditional understanding of history. So great men more or less lead history. So it's a question of will, and skill, diplomatic skill. So he attributed more or less wars to bad crisis management, we would say today, to bad diplomatic skills. So international relation could be mastered in his mind by human beings. So this mindset is quite the opposite of the Chancellor's mindset. So if I can describe his mindset, to say this was hardcore positivism. First, the Chancellor believed that there were impersonal forces in history, that there was a selection often by war. So he believed that there were powers of the future. So Russia, why Russia? Because Russia's demographic growth was more important than Germany's one. So 3 million for Russia each year, only 800,000 for Germany. And as a social Darwinist, he believed that the offspring was an indicator for who was the power of the future. So it's quite absurd for us to think, because we know that countries with so-called development problems are often demographically speaking on the top. But in this time, they believed that the offspring was decisive to evaluate who is the power of the future. So today it would be the World Bank benchmarking. So it would be other criteria. And he believed also in a racial determinism. He believed that the so-called Slavic race would be opposed automatically to the German one, and that war was more or less programmed by history, that these races were not compatible. And when the Jewish crisis started, he was a peaceful man, he was a nice man, but he believed that finally history had decided at this moment the big Armageddon, because the crisis started, as you know, in Sarajevo, and this was perceived as the start of the Slavic so-called, you can say, the rise of the Slavic power. That they were more and more attacking Germany and so on. So the idea is that even World War I was already, at least partly, inspired by scientific mindset. with the two identified mechanism of, for me, causality. First, overestimation of Russia. Overestimation because only attention to quantitative determinants. So German decision makers were only attentive to demographic growth, to geography. They ignored totally other determinants such as education and so on, national cohesion. Second, we have a strong determinism, so this time from racial science, and no more even evaluating others' intention, worst case scenario. And finally, we have the idea that it's not me, so it's not Bethmann Hollweg, it's not myself triggering World War I, but it's history. More or less, I'm accelerating a bit history. I have no choice. So it's clearly responsibility shift, and there's also neutralization of others, no compassion with victims. They are perceived, Russia is perceived not as, say, as an aggregation of individuals, but as a power rising in a quite abstract manner. So, and finally, we have, and I guess I have overrated my time limit, we have the famous zero. Okay, tiny. We have the case of so-called Islamist terrorism. And this is only an excursion, so it's only to provoke a bit a mindset. So we have the perception that at least Islamist terrorism is totally, or at least partly irrational, emotional. It's about misrecognition, stigmatization, and so on and so on. Probably all this is a bit true. But we have some indicators that even Islamist so-called terrorism may be linked to a hardcore positivist mindset. Why? First of all, there is the sociological profile. All or many of the 9/11 group studied hard science in countries where there is no École Polytechnique, so there are no human science. So categories are quite mechanically applied to society. So 8 out of 25 participating at 9/11 were engineers, for example. We have, there's another now published study from Princeton University Press showing that engineers are overrepresented in radical Islamist movements. So it's not to say this is a cause, but it's not incompatible. We have another indication that even in France, so I have conducted with 3 other researchers research in France, in French prison, about so-called radical Islamists. I have conducted some interviews, and we realized that first they claimed for themselves a kind of scientist religion, so it is very important for them to be called scientific, so referring to ulama, so it's a reasoning, scientist reasoning in the sense that they say we are not against homosexual, but it's written in the text. So it's not we are deciding this and that, it is more or less the text. And you have also, they are much less educated in France, as you know, people like the Nice bomber or the people from Charlie Hebdo. They were much less educated than, you can say the German word, Lumpenproletariat, a bit for them. But they have also more or less technical jobs as a car driver, the Nice guy, or they were spending time at, as we all, a bit at computer games, but they were more often quite socially isolated, spending much time with so-called machines, and even their own body was quite instrumental for them. So I realized that nearly all bombers, so-called bombers, were practicing fighting sport and cultivating their body. So this is one of the most sociological characteristics, it's kind of self-objectivation. They consider their body as an object which they sold to others. So it's a kind of positivism. You can see in the sense that I'm good because I can show, I have the mass of my body, indicates that I have this value. So what I want to say is they have objectified relations with human beings. So we find in their mindset something like quite abstract reasoning about victims. For example, the bombings, the 9/11 bombings, are explained as necessary for the Muslim community to, to be a rising force. There's always the idea that the whole has to determine or is much more important than individuals. So as a conclusion, so it's not really a conclusion, it must be an open conclusion because there will be a debate. So I would be a bit provocative in saying that many of our theories, war and peace theories, are maybe causes of war, in the sense that they postulate that material forces are per se causes of war. For example, power shifts, more or less strong interdependency, more or less democratic regimes, and so on and so on. No? And so we have in peace researchers, so-called peace researchers, attribute often wars not to mindsets, but to abstract material forces. And the idea is, if you believe that indeed material forces decide about peace and war, then again you have the possibility of responsibility shift. You say, I'm in conflict with this country because it's an authoritarian country. I have to eliminate it. Or I have to avoid this country because, or I cannot cooperate because it's a rising country. China, for example. I cannot, so maybe if we have the best will, we cannot because there are material forces. So this kind of reasoning can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, like the shock of civilization. Because probably this thesis is wrong, but people behave on what they believe. So it's a Thomas theorem. And so even bad ideas can become reality, unfortunately. So my plea would be for true human science. So it's not against science per se. So it would be only for social science preserving autonomy and attentive to social context, to actors' agency, and attentive to a particular situation, to individuals. So it's a plea for a more modest science. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Lindemann. I am now going to introduce the respondents. We have 4 respondents, and they have each been charged with speaking no more than 7 minutes. So we'll see how that works. And after that, we will then move to audience questions and discussion. Our first speaker is going to be Professor Robert Jarvis, who has been a member of the Columbia Political Science Department for a very long time, since 1980. He's also taught at the University of California, at Los Angeles, at Harvard University, and has served as president of the American Political Science Association. He is the co-editor of the Cornell Studies in Security Affairs, and he's the author, of many books, among them The Meaning of Nuclear Revolution, Complexity in Political and Social Life, American Foreign Policy in a New Era, and most recently, Why Intelligence Fails, Lessons from the Fall of the Shah and Iraqi Weapons of Mass Destruction. Our second respondent is going to be Dr. Carol Cohn, who is the founding director of the Consortium on Gender, Security, and Human Rights at UMass Boston. Her research and teaching focuses on gender and security issues, ranging from gender integration in the US military, feminist approaches in thinking about weapons of mass destruction, the gender dimensions of contemporary armed conflicts, and concepts of vulnerability. She also has worked on gender mainstreaming in international peace and security institutions, including the passage of UN Security Council resolutions on women and peace and security, and efforts to ensure their implementation. Her most recent book is Women and Wars, from 2013. Yasmin Ergas is director of the specialization on gender and public policy and a lecturer in discipline in the International and Public Affairs at Columbia, at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia. She directs the program in gender and human rights at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights. She is a lawyer and sociologist by training and has worked on many issues, both practice and scholarly work, research on gender and women's rights. She's worked as a policy analyst and advisor and as an advocate. She's served as a consultant to numerous international and domestic policy organizations, and her most recent research has focused on the emergence of an international market in reproductive services, with the resulting transformations of motherhood and the impacts of human rights on programs and policies. Tim Halpern-Healy, our last speaker, comes to us from the Department of Physics at Barnard and Columbia. He is the Ann Whitney Olin Professor of Physics, and he is a theoretical physicist who works on the dynamics of complexity, including quantum field theory, phase transitions, and other complex systems. He regularly co-teaches a course entitled Science, State Power, and Ethics, and he has been instrumental in a National Science Foundation grant on science education for tomorrow. So we have a really wonderful panel of respondents, varied and really august panel of respondents, and I'm very much looking forward to their response. So let's start. I'm going to welcome Bob Jarvis to the podium now.
Thank you, Pamela, and thank you, Thomas, who have met before in discussions in both here and in Paris. A real challenge to cover in 7 minutes, but I'm keeping my eye on, I'm sure you will too, because there's so much in the paper, and fortunately, since Thomas is with us for the semester, we'll have time to discuss this at greater length. That I think he's got a great question, and as part of the answer I disagree with, a lot of the, part of the answer I agree with, a lot of the answer I disagree with. I think it's the question of why do people, both scholars, members of the general public or elites, why do they divide on broad issues of how, if you will, alarmed or belligerent to be? And just as a shorthand, I'll talk about hawks and doves. It's very crude, but I think catches at least enough of this to work. I don't think we have a terribly good answer. I think it is a central question. And I think that we don't highlight it, and I think I applaud the project for highlighting it. Second, I agree with the first bullet point of the conclusion. As my late colleague Warner Schilling put it in his course on the causes of war, that theories of the causes of war can be a cause of war. And not only in this way, but in a lot of ways we could talk about. But then I have both theoretical and more, what I'll spend more on, empirical problems with the argument. First, I think the question of what is a hard, or as you have in the paper, monistic positivist, right? It's, it's a hard concept. And you had to go through it quickly here and even in the paper. And I'm not sure your elements entirely hang together. And I don't think in many cases I can trace the specific ones to the attitude that you are arguing. And then what I'll come to, I'm not sure I can populate the cells. I'm not sure I can find the people. So let me just say on a few of these, mostly on determinism, even Mearsheimer, I'll come back, find a few deterministic theorists in international politics, almost no statesmen. I think you're wrong on Bethman. I think there are a lot of, we'll talk later, I think that's a misreading. I think he does get fatalistic, but for a variety of reasons, not for the broad philosophical reasons. Certainly policymakers, I've read a lot, I've interacted with them, is antithetical to the way they see the world. They always see they have options, they always see they matter, and indeed that's often the function of alarmism. Alarmism is often meant from policymakers, from mid-level bureaucrats, from academics, to be a self-denying prophecy. To take just one case when most of us are alarmists, climate change, some of which I think is exaggerated. The point is to get action to avoid that. So you can't go from alarmism to belligerence. That link, I think, logically is wrong, and I think empirically is wrong. More important, I could do more on the theoretical links. Let me just say a couple of things on the case studies and then go to other evidence. Thucydides is a very slippery character. As you know, he can be read in lots of ways. You've taken away the older reading of Thucydides, rejected by a lot of more contemporary IR theorists. I don't have a clue who's right, but I just want to flag you can read him a lot of ways. And even if you say his theory is preventive war, I tend to agree. I think you're pushing him into the other aspects of the scientism. Similarly, Bethman and Lichnowsky, very interesting characters. I think you've you've made them fit. I think you've had to cut out a lot about them. Lichnowsky, after all, is really dealing mostly with Britain. He's not dealing with the broad issues. You may be right. I'd like to see what he does say about Russia. I don't know, but that's not where his focus is. And part of the reason for his trying to save things is, after all, that's his job. He's the ambassador to the country that may find a way out. I think he's admirable, I agree, but I'm not sure you can draw the difference in the way you did. Okay, turning more to empirically, just briefly, both Morton Kaplan and John Mearsheimer are real outliers in the American intellectual community for various reasons. They're not typical of anything other than themselves. It doesn't mean they're wrong or bad, but they don't stand for larger things. But most importantly, I'm not going to be able to substantiate this in the remaining few minutes, but if I look at, say, the US and Britain before World War I and before World War II, areas where I'm pretty familiar with the historiography. And if I look at the American divide in the Cold War, and if I look at the divide in Iraq, and again, roughly hawks and doves, I know it's a stereotype, but, or if I look to take a French case, Briand and Poincaré, especially in the 20s, and the transformation, the argument that Peter Jackson makes in his marvelous book about French policy there, I just don't think this cuts any ice. I think we can make crude divisions between hawks and doves. A lot of people shift, we can talk, but the division here is just not between those who are more scientific and those who aren't. World War II Winston Churchill is not more scientific than Neville Chamberlain. If anything, it's the reverse. Van Sittart, a crucial player in the Foreign Office. What does he say? He says, I understand Germany. I've got the intuition. My officials think I'm crazy. They don't understand Germany. I do. Argument from empathy and intuition. You tell him he's a scientist. He probably wouldn't hit you because he's a British gentleman, but he would certainly reject that. And I'm not an expert in the rest of his life, but I think it's hard to make that work. Pre-World War II, FDR versus the America Firsters. Lindbergh, who's the scientist? Right, clear Lindbergh. Now I'm picking them, but if you can take those categories, those large numbers, and sort them in this way, I'd be very impressed. In other words, I wouldn't believe it. But the Cold War, it doesn't work. Again, take individuals, my Columbia former colleagues, Brzezinski and Marshall Schulman. Not at all. Neither of them fit your hardcore positivist. The debate about the Soviet Union turned more on intentions than capabilities, and I'd argue, can't prove, those who were stressing the capabilities were those who believed the Soviets had malign intentions, not the other way around. And here I do work with these guys. I mean, it's just, they're driven by the analysis Soviet Union is evil and talk about whether they're right or wrong, but they're not driven by capabilities. The war in Iraq, what's striking is the American, if you will, realist with a capital R community. Those in IR will know what this means. The others may be fortunate enough not to. Could go into it if you want. Was almost unanimously against the war. Some were more quantitative than others. The people who opposed it most strongly included John Mearsheimer, by the way, which indicates that people who are belligerent in one area may not be belligerent in others. So, I just don't think, when I look at the central security debates I'm most familiar with, that I find the logic questionable, but the empirics just don't work at all. Now, I do want to close on back to a point I have a closer to agreement, although not complete. And this is the rise of China. I think you are right that those who are alarmed by China, but that doesn't mean they're belligerent, and I want to come back to the distinction, but those who are alarmed by China are driven by the generalization that as countries increase their power, they want more. More of what? More territory, more control, more status, whatever there is, more. I think that is not a perfect generalization, but it's pretty good. And I do think a lot of the, certainly IR community is in the middle ground. Yes, they're generalizations. They're rarely 100%, but they're better than nothing, because if we don't have anything, how are we judging individual cases? We're really using implicit generalizations, not explicit, and that's not a great way to proceed. But I do think that what drives, say, Mearsheimer's argument on China, which is a real outlier in the academic community, is a strong form of generalization. But a lot of those who believe there are laws see them much more probabilistically and see a lot of choice points, back to deterministic. And they would say, if I can read my writing on the China case, that there are the question would be, yes, there's going to be friction, and but many of those who are most alarmed do look at Chinese intentions, and they look at various, they don't resort to the ideological argument because there ain't no ideology there, but there are a lot of other intention arguments, and we can talk about them, that are quite powerful, maybe wrong, but quite powerful. And second, the question is how to adjust to this. You can take the generalization without saying there's going to be a war. You can say there has to be adjustment in East Asia, and I think that would be hard to deny, but that doesn't necessarily mean belligerence. So, I think that this is a really fascinating subject, and I look forward to arguing with you more during the semester and hearing my fellow commentators.
All right, and now for something completely different. First, I'd like to thank the organizers and all the people who worked hard to make this happen, as well as Professor Lindemann for his very interesting paper. Since I believe that who one is and where one is situated geographically, spatially, temporally, socially, has an impact on the perspectives that one brings, the kinds of knowledge that one has access to, affinity for, or even recognizes as knowledge. I'm going to start by saying something about where I'm coming from when I read this paper. First, given what I just said, it will surprise no one in the room that I am not a positivist. I don't believe that the surest way to knowledge is distance and objectification and the striving for neutrality, which I don't think is possible. When thinking about political relationships within and between states, and perhaps especially when trying to understand war, it doesn't make sense to me to strive for finding invariant rules governing human behavior, nor to believe that all social phenomena can be quantified, or more accurately, in practice, I think it doesn't make sense to restrict oneself to when things can be quantified and for which there are data sets. I think that humans are ineluctably meaning-making creatures whose perceptions and motivations to act or not act are enormously complicated, in part because we are all situated in multiple intersecting structures of power. And yes, that includes sort of macro-level geopolitical structures, but it also includes many others, including national and colonial histories, the remnants of class, caste, ethnic, religious, gendered hierarchies and inequalities that exist as a result of them, down to the microstructure, power structure of the family itself. And most critically, I don't think that when we operate within those structures that we somehow leave behind at the door things that we develop in one of them when we go to another. So I don't think, for example, that if you internalize what it means to be a real man in the context of your family, race, and class, that somehow you can park it at the door when you walk into the lab or into the National Security Council. So my beliefs about all of this, my beliefs about positivism and thinking about war in general, stem initially and formatively not from graduate training or theoretical commitments, but from time spent in participant observation with nuclear strategists, national security elites, and international security analysts. And that very much informs what I'm about to say. So, I'm not going to kind of get into the weeds about different parts of the arguments in the paper. What I want to do instead, I think, is try to push at one part of it and extend it further. The conclusion here, a plea for a human science attentive to social context and actors' agency, I think also inherent in your argument is a human science attentive to emotion and its roles in models of science and rationality. So something that Professor Lindemann didn't say, but is one of the last lines in the paper, is, quote, "The refusal to engage with others by empathic understanding finally only leads one to understand oneself." I think that it doesn't. I don't think that it leads to understanding oneself at all. In fact, quite the opposite. I think that positive beliefs that neutrality is possible, that invariant rules can be discovered, that who the scientist is should not and does not matter, that one can be objective, authorize a kind of lack of self-reflection that is both epistemologically and practically dangerous. Politically, I should add. So what might be found if one did some reflecting on this? Well, first of all, again, going back to Professor Lindemann's paper, he says, all positivist research is hostile to the attitude of empathic understanding of social behavior and considers that research does not only imply a distance from values, but also an emotional distance from what is observed. And then he says, I would hint to the fact that this attitude is rather connected to the understanding of virility. Hard science has to be freed from emotions and associated with female competencies. Well, the key here for me is not only that it has to be freed from the emotions which are associated with the feminine, but rather that emotions associated with the feminine get confused with emotions per se. And that in fact, so empathic understanding, yes, that's associated with the feminine and is banned. But I'd argue that there are a host of emotions that are evoked and acted upon in hardcore positivism that are not noticed or coded as emotions because of their association with manliness, which is seen de facto as rational, in opposition to femininity, which is seen as emotional. Now, I don't have the time to sort of run through all of the kinds of experience that have led me to these conclusions, but I'm just going to plunge in based on quite a lot of participant observation here. I think that if you look at the cognitive and intellectual practices of positivist science applied in international relations, you find that it is quite resonant with a desire to control, to corral, to bound, to make manipulable, a deep discomfort with randomness, messiness, unpredictability, the complexity of humans and of nature itself. I think that it encodes a particular version of protectiveness, not protectiveness in general, but a protectiveness that's associated with strength, with action, with aggression, rather than a protectiveness that might be associated with defensive postures, with restraint from taking action, both of those which are coded as passivity, which are also, and passivity in turn coded feminine. I think that you find it resonant with a pride and pleasure in manipulative competency, in dominance of complexity, maybe even with a kind of hubris in contrast to, for example, a stance of humility in the face of a universe, even a political universe, in which much cannot be known, which cannot be controlled, much cannot be controlled. I think you see a pleasure and comfort in distance and abstraction, and a discomfort with close engagement with the particularities of human existence, emotion, and human suffering, and the complexities of human motivation and interrelationship. All of these things that I'm talking about are feelings. I think that it also embodies and encodes a kind of fear and denial of vulnerability, which is, now of course some people would say, you know, security studies is all about vulnerability, but I think that it is the act of believing that one can conquer it in many ways, that what you see in positivist approaches to IR. To put it differently, I think we're all vulnerable as humans as well as states, and how do we respond to that vulnerability? There are different options, there are different possibilities, which are in fact based in emotion, I think, and strongly gender coded. You can locate it out there in a hostile other who you think you can wipe out, take out with drone strikes, with strength, aggression, militarized power, preventive war, and then be secured and safe. Or you can react with an acceptance of the impossibility of ever being able to fully protect or be protected, and then use, for instance, the weapons of the weak, something we never want to say or be associated with, the approaches that are used by those who do not have superior muscle and might, including the critical importance of not just empathic understanding of the other, but fully understanding the other to the greatest extent possible. Because when you're weaker than the other, the thing that keeps you alive is your understanding of the other. So when I talk about these sets of emotions that in turn I think lead to a set of choices and cognitive responses, I'm not saying that the emotions that are evoked by or embodied in and maybe sated by hardcore positivism delegitimate it as a mode of thought. All modes of thought, I think, are associated with different kinds of emotional approaches. I'm not saying that they explain the motivations of the people who do positive work. That would obviously be a hugely reductionist explanation, and exactly my point is that human behavior is incredibly multiply produced, incredibly complex. What I am saying, though, is that those emotions those emotions exist, that they fail to get noticed or acknowledged as emotions because of their symbolic association with Again, in his paper, Professor Lindemann talks about virility or masculinity. It wasn't a part of the presentation here. And hence with rationality, and with distance from the feminine, understood as the emotional and irrational, and that this is dangerous. In other words, that it not only sort of undermines the basic epistemological assumption of positivism, which is that you can and do banish emotions. I think demonstrably that doesn't happen. But also that the illusion of perfect objectivity and neutrality and the corresponding lack of perceived need for self-reflexivity, for examining what are the feelings underlying what you're doing, leads, I think, to a kind of certitude about having a lock on reality, on what may be inevitable, on one's own models being correct, that foreclose thinking about a very wide variety of other responses to vulnerability, say, or even to decline that might lead to different actions and less violence. So that's it.
Well, for a very different take again. So thank you, first of all, very much to Pamela and to the organizers for this opportunity to reflect on what I would characterize as the ironies of theory with Professor Lindemann and with all of you. I'm now quite sure, having heard Professor Jervis, that Hegel remarked somewhere that all great theories appear twice, so to speak. He forgot to add the first time as political science, the second time as war. And so it is with Professor Lindemann's rendition of hardcore realist positivism. It dons the mantle of prevention only to legitimate aggression. I come at this question of preventive war from a very different perspective. That is from the perspective of international law, a discipline which that kind of hardcore realist positivism, to the extent to which we can actually identify a movement in those terms, has found alternatively irrelevant, fanciful, and dangerous. This perspective has been, in my view, best summarized recently by John Bolton, who sees in international law a plot against America, except when it enshrines American interests. And I commend John Bolton to your attention, Professor Lindemann, because he is a potential candidate for Secretary of State should the calamity of a Trump administration come to pass. Bolton asks, is there really law in international law? He reasons that international law does not issue from a sovereign power, is not subject to constitutional procedures, can be changed through non-compliance, and fatally aspires to rule-bind the United States' capacity to exercise its power. So in this very caricatured vision, international law and the kind of realist positivism that we could say that Bolton represents can actually be seen as polar opposites. The first claims that international law, taken on one side, claims that international rules can, should, and do constrain states' right to war. The second affirms that states' rights to war are what ought to constrain the rules that we develop. The first sees sovereignty as the right to bind oneself in agreement. The second sees instead sovereignty as the right not to be bound by agreement. The first law tends to affirm the centrality of cooperation among common goals. The second, an anarchic pursuit of interest in essentially zero-sum environments. Moreover, and I realize that this is very caricatured and that one could doubt that there really are many exponents of this perspective. But taking it as good, if realist positivism describes or embodies a deterministic belief in evolutionary process that promotes fatalism, as Professor Lindemann suggests in his paper, and renders comprehension of the other irrelevant. International law, at least in its liberal positivist variant, asserts the possibility of changing the course of events through agreement, which in turn presumes some measure of reciprocal understanding. The reason that I draw out this analogy is because to me it suggests in terms of fields the same approach or pairing approach that Professor Lindemann actually adopts in his paper, comparing Archidamos and Stephanelidis, my pronunciation is going to be terrible, Chancellor Bethman, and Count Lichnowsky. And it is from this pairing, or from this comparison and continuous coexistence, from the suggestion of an implicit possibility of a dialogue, that I derive the three questions that I would like to pose to you. I characterize these questions as being institutionalist, discursive, and essentially historical. So my first question regards the power of ideas. Keynes, as you all know, remarked that the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Nonetheless, political decision makers do not spin their decisions wholly out of the cloth of their ideas. The fate of the theories that they espouse is directly bound with the conditions that they find close at hand. Thus, many international relations scholars have cast international law as a straitjacket that states widely, wisely, and one might say with right and might on their side, disregard. As a result, the question political scientists have queried not so much international law's impotence as much as its effectiveness. Why do, this is the question, why do powerful states obey powerless rules? Why, in other words, do the ideas embodied in international law gain credence and become policy? And that, I think, is the central question. Answers with respect to law have variously emphasized state interests, coordination, cooperation, reputational and other forms of capital that may be associated with compliance, the development of international networks of policymakers, and the forms of socialization, learning, credentialism, and legitimation that accompany them, and also the ways in which state action reflects the mobilization of bias, such that compliance results from the correspondence between the interests of the segments of the society that are fixed in international accords and the power of those segments of society to determine state policy. Scholars looking at the political power of economic ideas have also adopted varying perspectives. Peter Hall, for example, categorized these as being variously centered on economists, states, and coalitions, but I'm sure that we could find other explanatory variables as well. So my question to you is, what institutional and other configurations make the kind of scientific positivism that you describe work to promote war under the guise of prevention? A related question regards what I would describe as the elective affinity between scientific positivism, as you describe it, the notions of preventive war, and other frameworks. For me, in particular, the framework that regards international regulation, international law. So what I'm really interested here is more generally the discursive field in which you could and should situate, in my view, the notion of preventive war. Why, for example, the emphasis on prevention? What is it, and I think in the paper you talk about this a little bit, what is it that is not being said when prevention is being emphasized? What is the logic of state action that is in fact being delegitimated or cast aside, a deconstructionist might say that I'm being deconstructionist in this question. But the hypothesis that comes to my mind is that, for example, the idea of banning aggression, which is central to modern international law, that has sought in many ways both to limit aggression to defense and to strictly curtail the scope of self-defense, right, suggests that either, and in an extremist version maybe, international law is actually providing the background ideas against which the logic of preventive war is being developed, or that they share a common framework, and that that's the common framework that makes sense of the notion of preventive war, and that we ought to try to understand. And my third question, as I said, is historical, and it regards the conjunction of what I see as a conjunction in the rise of law and the apotheosis of what you have described as positivism. So in Professor Lindemann's focus on several periods, one of the ones that's central is the one that regards World War I, and which coincides approximately with a moment that saw major developments in international law and international institutions, including later the establishment of the League of Nations, and particularly what came to my mind in reading this paper is the agreement of the ill-fated Kellogg-Briand Pact, that is, the General Treaty for the Renunciation of War as an instrument of national policy. So we all know that the treaty proved clamorously ineffective. And of course it came after World War I. But it did follow on the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, in which limitation on the use of force had been agreed. Similarly, I could argue that the current moment sees both the conjunction of ISIS's adoption, in your words, of a positivist approach to justify war, but also a radical expansion in the forms and the objects of international law, more or less effective, but nonetheless surely in a state of growth. So, as Peter Gurevich once wrote, we need to explore the broader political contexts that allow the predilections of specific individuals to become policies. I would formulate that question as a need to understand why international law and the kind of scientific realist positivism that you describe can coexist and prompt action coexist often in the same discursive space, prompting action that adopts conflicting but intersecting frameworks, that's legitimated in terms of conflicting, or explained in terms of conflicting but intersecting frameworks, purporting to address the same or very close issues, sovereignty, war, the power of states, endorsed often by the same actors. After all, the law that we've been talking about is made by the very same actors, states, who then make the war that we've been talking about, developed at the same time. I'd be happy to talk more about the thematic overlaps between law and this version of positivism as you lay it out, but basically I'm trying to push you to explain more the effectiveness, efficacy, and actual capacity of this framework to become a logic of aggression, rather than to simply remain in the space of what I've described as an ironic theory. Thank you.
Thanks again to Pamela and the rest of the folks for the invitation tonight. Wondering if there are any positivists left in the audience? I'm guessing probably not, and I certainly am not one of them myself. I'm not sure where to begin exactly. Perhaps with the conclusion is an interesting place. Scientists' theories constitute self-fulfilling prophecies. So there is implicit the whole idea of determinism, which as a physicist really strikes a chord with me. That is, if I were a physicist living in the 18th century, not a physicist living in the 21st century. Because determinism was, of course, the hallmark of physics in that time, to be able to predict where the planets will be. The discovery of comets from a series of observations. It was all about doing the calculation and then predicting when that comet would return. So you would be famous and it would be named after you. But by the end of the 19th century, with some developments in thermodynamics, entropy, chaos, and disorder, mathematicians certainly were beginning to appreciate the fact that even very simple systems can exhibit extremely complex behavior. A pendulum, for example, just something swinging back and forth like in a clock. If you drive it, okay, with sufficient force, it can behave in an entirely unpredictable way. So physicists of the 20th and 21st century practices extreme caution in imagining what their intuition might tell them about a physical system, non-sentient, okay, non-empathic, okay, physical system. So anyhow, the issue of determinism, as I said, kind of set off a red light, obviously. But then the second part is intriguing to me in the course I teach in Science and Public Policy, which focuses on the decisions in World War I and World War II. When the scientists provide, or the physicists provide, okay, right? World War II is when physicists came to know original sin because they had produced the bomb. They produced the bomb thinking that Germany had a bomb, but we now know that they didn't. So there was an alarmism there which made a decision, an irreversible decision, that has forever changed the world. But I also came to learn, as a physicist, from my political science colleague that I co-teach the course with, about the other agents in history, like ambassadors, and the important role that they play in informing the conversation, imagining the other side, because they've interacted with the other side. So this kind of ties into the second point here. So you'll have your folks in the think tank, the game theorists, okay, doing the calculations. That'll perhaps be part of the decision. But coming back to the second piece of that first point, okay, it's the decision makers, it's the politicians who aggregate this information. And so it's really on their shoulders, in some sense, to be well informed about many of the things, okay, the folks on the panel have alluded to. That doesn't take some of the responsibility off of the folks, okay, in the think tank doing the game theory calculations. So a couple of things caught my eye, again, in the paper, but not so much in the talk. I really appreciated the talk, and I appreciated your sending us the paper ahead of time. It was very courageous. But as I read through the paper, there were a number of things that, of course, caught my eye. And it has to do, of course, with the positivists, the hardcore positivists, which I wonder, in some sense, they're kind of a straw man, right? Because there's hardly anything positive to say about them. You can understand some of their thinking in the context of the time in which they lived. Comte, for example, as you say in the paper here, in his lecture on positive philosophy, he defends the idea that mathematics should be an instrument for all other sciences in the quest of laws of nature. Okay, so that's a bold and understandable vision that one might have for the founder of sociology, right? So that resonates with me. Jumping ahead almost 200 years to Kaplan, 1966, I was really intrigued by, I guess, a statement that was from a Kaplan paper, which again is this business about determinism. that the future follows immediately or linearly or in some as a simple function of the present is an extraordinary idea. Okay, I need to know that function. Okay, so I can change my investment portfolio to take advantage. But anyway, the statement from the Kaplan article is that the future is predictable. So this is a 1966 paper. And the future is predictable on the basis of systemic properties. Strategic surprises are reduced to parameter changes in the system comparable to the, quote, phenomenon of superconductivity under conditions of extreme temperature and pressure. So the idea that at the end of the day, the whole discussion, whatever that discussion may be, could be reduced to essentially a knob that's being turned, okay, a phase transition. As the temperature is dropped, some system orders, or going the other direction, disorders. So it's an intriguing notion. It's a notion which you might think would follow in some more complicated way, perhaps in a game theoretic construct. But it's certainly something that I would hesitate to put any money on. It reminded me of a famous quote. Actually, it's the title of a paper written by Eugene Wigner, Nobel Prize winner in 1963, Hungarian, brilliant mathematician, but who worked in mathematical physics. And the title of the paper was The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences, which is a legend, okay, for folks in the physics and chemistry communities. He went on to relate a mathematical formulation of a physicist's crude experimental measurements, okay, in an uncanny number of cases, okay, leads to an amazingly accurate description of a large class of phenomena. So as a physicist, I can think of gravitation in the 17th century, electricity and magnetism, Maxwell's equations in the 19th century. And eventually in 20th century, quantum electrodynamics by Richard Feynman. But Richard Feynman was particularly sensitive to the character of physical law and what universal laws, okay, require. And it's hard, again, from my point of view, to imagine, as the positivist might argue, that there exist universal laws of sociology and society and human engagement and interaction. So since that date, in 63, or in 60 when Wigner wrote that, there have been kind of various riffs on that. Riffs on the miraculous relationship of math and physics. Wigner mentioned, it is a wonderful gift which we neither deserve nor understand. We're grateful for it and hope that it will remain valid in future research and will extend, for better or for worse, okay, to our pleasure and perhaps to our bafflement, okay, to wider branches of learning, okay. So this was picked up by Gelfand more recently, and thinking about biology, okay, as a counterpoint to Wigner's phrase or title, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences, Gelfand, in the context of biology, or mathematical biology, remarked, there is only one thing that's more unreasonable than the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics and physics, and this is the unreasonable ineffectiveness of mathematics in biology. So perhaps I'll leave it at that. I'm very happy and interested in engaging in further dialogue, and thanks again, Thomas, for your paper. Appreciate it.
Test.
for the microphone is for the video.
So first of all, many thanks for the luxury comments, or comments of luxury, luxury professors. And so I will just respond to the general idea. I hope to capture your general idea. So first of all, your main remark, Robert, was about, sure, oversimplification, empirical fragility, and so on. So I have only to precise that at the very start it's about preventive war. So my ambition is not to say now that all people with a scientific mind are dangerous guys. So that will be overextended. But I would contest that there are preventive war conceptions without a scientific mindset. This I would contest. Because the preventive war conception already implies a kind of anticipation, kind of planification, systematization. So if you can quote me any preventive war thinker without any scientific mindset, this would be fine. So, so it is not to say that all, so it's only a type of violence which I try to explain with this scientific mindset. Maybe I've overextended this to terrorism, so it can be maybe not, it's too heterogeneous, I guess, from a positivist point of view. So this would be my main response. So for Churchill, you are right. There are people who might have a kind of preventive war logics, but not truly systematic. You quoted him as somebody, so it was of his inner feeling, but it would, for me, not a preventive war. He dislikes Germany, so this from even before World War I. So it was nearly antipathy, so natural antipathy, and he was the right man in a good situation. So he would be considered probably as a crazy guy if he would be prime minister in the 60s. So hopefully he was in the Second World War. So it was by chance a bit that he was the guy of the situation. So many thanks also for your comments. So I guess, so I will start, so you start, but I will inverse the role. So your main objection is a bit, how can we combine preventive war logics with the law logics in international relations? And so it is not compatible. And I can even quote you the German Chancellor, who considered the engagement for British neutrality as a scrap of paper. So it is quite typical that all hardcore positivists are always against, you can say, law, because they believe that, for example, demographic forces are dynamic, rising, and so law is too stable, so it is not conform to moving borders. Borders should be moved to demographic growth. So I would say my response is probably, again, that it's not a general theory, so that we are, I would agree that scientific logics are counterbalanced by law engagement. So again, my explanation is only valuable for preventive war logics. And take Bush, Bush's son, he clearly was not a legalist. And you can consider that he's a bit linked to preventive war logics, contrary to his father, who seems to be more engaged to this law logics. So they do have mental maps quite different. I don't know whether George Bush Jr. is a scientist, but I would argue that neoconservative maybe. They are, at least they have some dogmatic world vision, so they are quite close to quite closed international understanding of international relations. So it's not totally, I would say, contrary to this mindset.
Neo-Communists, a lot of the Straussianism, which is quite antithetical than most forms of positivism.
You're right that Strauss formally is opposed to positivism, but it's you you can say it's a dogmatic anti-positivism, which seems to be a copy what it contests in some ways. So universalism is another universalism. Okay, this is, I admit, a case to discuss. So thank you, Carol, for your thoughtful description. You integrated what I have a bit left out, because at the very start, my ambition was to link it more to a kind of masculine framework. We all know that, we have in international relations the idea of the hero protector, and this is also linked to preventive war logics. We have to protect our country, and so there's also even formally positivists do not want to display any emotions. They are strongly invested in the role of the hero protector. And you're linked very nicely to the masculine emotional dynamics. And so I agree perfectly with your analysis about also positivism, mastering. It is clear that it's much more than analysis. If you categorize people, you want to act. So preventive war is already a science in action to do something. I only agree, unfortunately, with you. And so many thanks also, Tim. You showed that indeed, and this is a bit a paradox, that what our hardcore positivists believe now to be science, and even economists, is indeed science which was probably popular in the 18th century. It's the Newton logics, and it's not at all, I would say, that real scientists, modern scientists, are open to friction, to the idea that for you it seems obvious that there is no universal law logic. So it would be interesting to see why, for example, it seems to be that engineer school in other places may be still attached to Newton logics. I don't know whether there are other places where science is not taught in an open manner. So it could explain this artificial link. So this is quite a bit paradox that we try to be harder than hard science actually is in order to legitimate us for resources. So if you would truly apply properly natural science, it would be more to social science would be much more open than it is in the moment with econometrics and others. So again, so only a very rudimentary comment for a very thoughtful contribution. And
thank you. Good. Let's open it up to the audience now.
Who was a scientist by training, who at that time was the president of India, and was faced with the situation of preventive war in the region of Kashmir, wherein there was no violent outcome. There was only some sort of communal violence in the region, but neither of the countries resorted to, neither of the nations nor leaders resorted to violent reaction. So.
More questions? There's one.
Sorry, thank you. I am working for the French Permanent Mission to the United Nations. I have a simple, quick question. Thank you for this meeting, and it's very, very useful, and it's very timely because today was the opening session of the 71st General Assembly, which would have to elect the new Secretary General starting 1st of January 2017. So my question would be, what advice would you give to the next Secretary General to make peace and security more effective and better, and to reflect, I would say, more efficiently what's embedded in the United Nations Charter of 1945. Thank you.
So why don't we start with that question?
So,
speaks to implementation.
Okay, implementation. So I would be careful. So my first answer to the last question would be, let's first consider the situation, the concrete situation, before acting too quickly, to analyze too quickly, say something too quickly. So it's not, I'm not So positive thinking is always to apply something. Maybe you should first take a look at situation to understand. So my first advice would not to decide too quick anything. So it's not a negative advice, negativism. To answer a bit at the very first question, so to question about the mindset of the Soviet leaders. Why there is no conflict, why there was no armed conflict. It's a bit the idea between the Soviet Union and the United States, in spite of the fact that clearly there is a scientific mindset of the Soviet leaders. And the US, okay. But maybe, okay. So my answer would be, so I have asked this question myself. And so the difference with the social Darwinism of World War I is that the Soviet ideology is optimistic. So Soviet leaders believed that future is always on our side. We can wait. So there were works of Nathan Late's operational code. So the advantage with this kind of scientism is that there is no panic. So historical forces quite naturally will give us time, and even Gorbachev, maybe he was a true communist, I don't know, it is still worth to discuss. He could believe that first we have not managed the transition to industrial society, to capitalism, so we have first to move from, I don't know, feudal society to capitalism, and after there will be socialism, so all will be fine. So there are different scientism. And probably the most dangerous, if you want, for war, is a declinist scientism. So ideologies of decline. You all have heard about, there are stories in the library about America's decline for now 40 years. So these are clearly the most dangerous versions. There are other which may be quite pacific. You had another question for...
There was the question...
yeah, could empathy be positivist also? Yeah, sure. There are positivists trying to measure empathy. But okay, if you try to measure empathy, this would be my argument. You go beyond individual cases. So you already frame something as typical, and maybe you will not have all this complexity to link to. So I'm not sure whether it is truly possible.
Do you want to respond to the third question? Does anyone? I think at this point. Oh yes, go ahead, please, Professor Jarvis.
The strongest advocate for preventive war was Bertrand Russell.
Yeah. With that, I think we need to close tonight, and we can continue the conversation at the reception here, the very nice reception provided by Maison Française. And I would like to very much thank Professor Lindemann, my colleague Frederic Breitenmacher, of course, Professor Biot, and each of the respondents. Please help me thank all of these speakers tonight.